President Trump is leaving open the possibility of U.S. military action in Nigeria as he accused the nation of not stemming violence against Christians there. The president has asked the Defense Department to prepare options, that could include troops on the ground or airstrikes. The situation on the ground, however, is far from straightforward. Violence in Nigeria does affect Christians, but also Muslims, and is driven by religious, ethnic, and resource-based tensions in that country. Joining me now, Fareed Zakaria, host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN. He also has a new book, Age of Revolutions, releases in paperback tomorrow. Make sure to get your copy. They're always, Fareed, you're so good at just making us understand what's happening globally. Let's talk about what's happening with Trump in Nigeria. He's suddenly suggesting potentially putting troops on the ground or airstrikes. But he's already threatened strikes inside Venezuela, and we've been seeing the multitude of strikes on boats in international waters, killing more than a dozen people. For a guy who is insisting he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for stopping wars, how do you read what's happening now?
It seems very impulsive and emotional. He possibly saw something on TV. It is very strange. The Nigerian situation is exactly as you said, Sarah, very complicated. A lot of the violence people have heard about in Nigeria, Boko Haram, that terror group that took those school children we all remember. That was mostly Muslim on Muslim violence. Those are jihadi groups often taking, killing Muslims, not in all cases, but in many of them. There is Muslim Christian violence, as you say, some of it is based on farmers versus goat herders. The current president, Tinubu, has actually been trying his best to diffuse that kind of violence and is himself an exemplary example of Nigeria's kind of multi-religious tradition. He is Muslim, the president of Nigeria. He's married to a Christian woman who is an ordained minister. And he often talks about how that marriage is part of what he's trying to do. Nigeria is 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. So it's an odd place for President Trump to interject himself, particularly militarily. I suspect, like many of President Trump's, emotional outbursts, that will not actually lead to military action. That could set off a kind of tinderbox in Nigeria. But we just have to wait and see. With President Trump, it's often you're trying to mind read this one man.
Yeah, and that can be quite difficult. I do want to talk to you about speaking of President Trump, what he told 60 Minutes, particularly when it comes to those nuclear tests that he is talking about doing after some more than 30 years where these tests just have not happened. Let me let you listen to what he told Norah O'Donnell.
So why do we need to test our nuclear weapons?
Well, because you have to see how they work. You do have to. And the reason I'm saying testing is because Russia announced that they were going to be doing a test. If you notice, North Korea is testing constantly. Other countries are testing. We're the only country that doesn't test, and I don't want to be the only country that doesn't test.
I was surprised to hear him say, we have to see how they work. We know how they work. We were the one that used them on Japan. But if the U.S. starts blowing off nuclear weapons, is this going to start a chain reaction with Russia and China following suit?
It almost certainly will. I'm not sure, some of this is classified information and we don't have access to it. But conventionally, it's believed that Russia and China and mostly everyone stopped in the mid-1990s. North Korea is the exception. But the major nuclear powers have tended to believe that they can figure out whether or not these weapons work without doing these underground tests, that have all kinds of environmental issues. It also it kind of has the tendency to trigger more of an arms race. But look, I think I know where President Trump is coming from on this issue. He wants leverage in these negotiations that we should be engaging in with the Russians and the Chinese. The big nuclear fact that we need to come to terms with is that China is on track to, I think, roughly quadruple the number of nuclear weapons it has over the next 10 years. That is a huge shift in the nuclear balance of power, and we should be trying to engage them in terms of negotiations and arms control. And if you need some leverage in that area, I'm not entirely opposed to it.
All right, Fareed Zakaria, got your new book out. Thank you so much for coming on early this morning with us as well.
We want to return our attention now to Africa, where President Trump is leveling new threats of military action in Nigeria. Writing on Truth Social over the weekend that, in his words, if the Nigerian government continues to allow the killing of Christians, then the U.S. military may very well go into Nigeria, quote, guns a-blazing, to completely wipe out the Islamic terrorists who are committing these horrible atrocities. Here's a little bit more from the U.S. president.
They're killing record numbers of Christians in Nigeria. And they have other countries very bad also. You know that part of the world, very bad. They're killing the Christians and killing them in very large numbers. We're not going to allow that to happen.
CNN's Nick Robertson is following these developments for us. So, Nick, I guess sort of a two-part question to start with. Number one, what is the reality of these claims that President Trump is making? And then two, how is Nigeria's government reacting to the threats from the U.S. president?
Yeah, and I think the sort of two things coincide in a way that both the Nigerian government and agencies sort of that investigate these attacks say that the data doesn't stack up with what the president is describing. Indeed, the former Nigerian foreign minister, who's also the former finance minister, is also currently the Director General of the World Trade Organization in London today, speaking earlier on with CNN, said that it's a very complex situation, that it is not perhaps as simple as the president portrays it, that there are other issues, there are environmental issues, and this is what the research is finding, and this is what government officials inside Nigeria are saying, that yes, Christians are being killed where these Islamist terror groups operate in the north of Nigeria, but also in perhaps even greater number, Muslims are being killed. The majority of the north of Nigeria is a majority Muslim population. So Muslims are being killed as well as Christians at the hands of these radical Islamists. So the picture that the president paints that this is just hitting Christians is being, if you will, taken apart and taken exception to. And the other thing that's being pointed out is this religion is not the only issue here. There are issues there of community, of land use. There are farmers there who grow crops on the land, traditionally Christians, but there's also conflict with the herders who move and follow the cattle. They're mostly Muslims. So the issues there are complex and beyond the way the president presents them. We've also heard from the advisor to the president of Nigeria, who said, look, we don't take what the president is saying at face value. We sort of see it, as he's done with other situations around the world, as a sort of an opening statement that may lead to a conversation with other Nigerian officials. And he said bluntly, we'd welcome support from the United States as long as it respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity of our country. He said we would like better fighter aircraft to combat these Islamist groups, better drones, better equipment. He said we have the troops. What we need better is support, military equipment support from the United States. I think at that level, what the president is stating as a cause is being taken down, and how it's being reflected back by the government in Nigeria is, yes, there's an issue of people being killed in our country. Would like some help. Can you do it?
Yeah, well, in terms of that help, too, part of that initial post from President Trump started with him warning that he would end, in his words, quote, all aid and assistance to Nigeria, before going on to talk about going in guns a-blazing. In terms of that aid and assistance that already exists, what would that impact be?
Well, the impact would be probably greater impoverishing the north of the country, where aid is being delivered. I visited there with, at the time, the British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, before he became Prime Minister, 2017, I think it was, so about 8 years ago almost. The conditions on the ground were the same. I was there with his foreign development official as well, who was the minister for that, who was in charge of aid. And the aid was going into hospitals there to help with the people who'd been injured in these attacks. And the aid as well was going to feed people in that area where the effects of this Islamist violence was destroying the economy, because people were being blown up by suicide bombs in the middle of their towns, in the middle of their markets. Indeed, I talked to one young man in the hospital there who said, look, what we really want here is actually talks with these rebels to leave us, the civilians, alone and let us get on with our lives. So even back then, people were saying, we need help not only with the food aid, not only with the medical aid that's coming in, but we need aid as well, support, if you will, to get into a conversation with these groups and stop the attacks. So I think at all those levels, when you stop international aid going in, you worsen the conditions and situation of the population.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, appreciated the context. So key, as always. Thank you.